Hey guys, it's Jake here with eTrailer. Today we're going to be taking a look at and installing the Air Lift LoadLifter 5000 air helper springs on our 2022 Toyota Tundra. Air helper springs are going to help to support the rear end of your vehicle when you're hauling something in the bed of your truck or from the hitch. With newer trucks, they tend to have softer coil springs for a nice ride quality, but what that leads to is that anytime you put any amount of weight on the back of the truck, it's going to cause a significant amount of squat compared to the older Leaf style springs that were on older vehicles. So when hauling those heavy loads, the air helper springs are going to help to level out your load so that your truck is not squatting in the rear and you can get your headlights pointed back down on the road and a more sound contact with the front tires on the ground. So today we have a TRD edition, but this is going to be the same application for any of the 22 Toyota Tundras. Basically what an air helper spring is, it's going to be an adjustable jounce bumper. So instead of having a jounce bumper that's always engaged, or like the factory jounce bumpers you may notice, they're about 6 inches away from the part of the axle that it actually hits, so you have to squat 6 inches in order for them to engage. These are going to be adjustable, so no matter how light or heavy your load is going to be, you're going to be able to adjust the air pressure in the bags to match the load that you're hauling. I have a set of airbags on my truck, and I find myself, even when hauling the same load, that I find myself adjusting more and more to find a better PSI to put in the bags so that my ride is as good as it can be. Now, a quick measurement unloaded from the ground to the top inside of our wheel well here is going to be about 39.25 inches. So we'll go ahead and load up our pontoon boat and see what that does to the squat on the truck. Now we're getting 38.25 inches. So yeah, that is just an inch of squat, but this truck is already pretty well level when it's unloaded, so that inch means a lot in the terms of squat. Now, speaking to how the squat affects the front, we are still loaded, but we'll go ahead and take a quick measurement. We're looking at about 38.75 inches with our load on. So we'll go ahead and take the boat off and see what our measurement is. Now, we ran over the shop, we put about 25 pounds in each of our airbags, and we can see we're right back to that factory ride height. So you can see how big a difference that just having the airbags on and with a little bit of air in them is enough to support the rear end. And I can tell you, we don't even have that much weight on the tongue of this, or on the hitch of this truck. There's only about 350, maybe 400 pounds from the tongue of this boat. But if you get something much heavier, maybe an 8,000 pound camper or something like that, you're going to have more like 800 to 900 pounds on the back. So having that adjustability in the bags is really going to help you. Now, one feature about these bags that will separate it from a lot of other airbag kits is that these are actually going to have internal jounce bumpers on the inside of the bag itself. So what that does is that allows you to carry a load for a short period of time so that you can get to an air source in order to put some air in the bags. It also works as a fail-safe, so if one of your bags ends up blowing or one of the lines comes loose, that internal jounce bumper is going to provide the support so you don't crush the bag. Now, there is one accessory that I would always recommend when thinking about getting a set of airbags. I've had airbags for about 5 years now, and I had them without an onboard air compressor, and it was such a pain because you don't know when you're supposed to load the bags with the air. I did a lot of landscape side jobs, so I would have to load the air into the airbags before I left, but my whole drive to pick up material was super rough. And the same thing, if you're using it for camping, that's a little bit easier, but you're gonna have to air up before you leave your house if you're picking it up at a storage place. So adding an onboard air compressor is gonna allow you to change the PSI in your bags on the fly, and that is priceless. So that is definitely something I'd recommend. When it comes to the installation for these airbags, it's a very straightforward installation. It should only take you a couple hours to get installed. The custom bracketry fits great. We didn't have to make any modifications to the vehicle other than removing the bump stops. So with that being said, let's go ahead and pull the truck into the shop and show you how it's done. Now for the installation, you want to start by lifting your tires off the ground. So you can do this with a floor jack and jack stands at your home. We have the benefit of using a lift, but that's so that you guys can see the installation a little bit clearer. What you want to do is you want to jack the rear of the vehicle up from the axle and then place your jack stands underneath. Then you'll take your floor jack and go back to your hitch on your truck and lift up on the hitch so that you can alleviate some of the pressure of the suspension. It's going to help get those components in place a lot easier. We're going to start here. Now that our vehicle's up in the air, we're going to take our driver's side wheel off. With our tire removed, you'll see the jounce bumper here. We'll need to remove all 3 of the 12mm bolts on the frame. Now your jounce bumper is not going to be reinstalled because your airbag is going to be sitting right here, but we do need to remove this little plastic piece out of the frame. You can use a screwdriver or a trim panel tool like we did, and you pop it right out. Now here on the passenger side, we're going to have to remove these 2 bolts to be able to remove this module and set it aside. Now we're going to get our airbag put together. We'll start by taking one of our roll plates, placing it over top of our airbag, and you want to start with the side that has the 2 threaded holes and then the 1 air inlet. Then we'll take our plate. Now depending on which side of the vehicle you're putting this on will depend on which direction this little notch here will face. You're going to want this notch to face the front of the vehicle for no matter which side you're doing. So we'll start by taking our 2 bolts here, sliding them up through the bottom, and then setting it down over top of those threaded holes. We'll take 2 of our button head bolts, the larger ones that come in your kit, and thread them down into those nuts in the top of the bag. Now we're going to hand tighten all this, and then at the end torque everything down to the specifications in the instructions. Then we can flip it over, and we'll do the same. Take our plate, there's a little cutout here in the sticker. Slide it over, except this time we're going to face this portion here, which is going to sit on top of your axle. We're going to face it the same direction as this little notch. Set it on top. Let's slide these 2 larger bolts up through the square holes. And then use those same 2 button head bolts and thread them in on top. Now when tightening these down, the instructions are going to say to use a 5mm. In our case, we're using a 5.5mm. The 5mm you can see here is just a little too loose, but the 5.5 fits great. The last thing we need to do to our airbag set here is to thread in our air inlet. You want to thread it in hand tight, and then you want to do 1.5 turns with a wrench to get it snug down. Now we're going to do the same thing for assembly to our other airbag. You just want this notch to be on the other side of the plate. Now back on our vehicle, we'll want to take a plate that looks like this with our little tab facing towards the front of the vehicle. That's to help make up for the curvature in the frame, how it goes in a little bit. We'll want to hold it up to the bottom of the frame where we took those 2 factory bolts out of our jounce bumpers. And you want to thread these in to those factory weld nuts. You want to just tighten them by hand and leave them loose so that you can adjust this bracket back and forth for the next step. Now we'll take our other bracket and set it on top of our plate. You may have to tighten your bolts a little bit more. I don't have them quite tight enough to see. But you want to line it up, slide your plate forward and backwards so that you can still get a bolt in this hole and that your holes line up from the plate down and you can see clearly that all the hardware is going to fit. And once we get everything lined up, then we can tighten and torque these bolts that are in the frame weld nuts. Now just a tip for you guys, when adjusting this plate and aligning these holes, before you tighten these bolts, I struggle with the other side with getting these two holes to line up after I tighten this because it adjusted. Go ahead and slide 2 bolts down in these holes and then make sure your hole up here still aligns. You can see it's not really aligned now. So we'll slide it over a little bit. And now we can tighten these bolts, and I'm just going to leave these attached while I do that. And you'll want to refer to your instructions to get the torque specifications for these 2 bolts. Now we'll remove the bolt that's holding in our emergency brake line. Now we need to remove this bolt that's holding our brake line bracket in place. And all we're going to do is take this bracket, slide it over, open it up a little bit, enough to get it off, and then flip it around, snap it back on, and put it back in place. This is going to help us to get the brake line out of the way of our airbag bolt. Now we'll take these 2 carriage bolts we used to check our spacing out, and then we'll grab our airbag assembly and slide it up into place. You'll want this tab here to be facing in towards the center of the vehicle. Can be kind of tricky to get this in here, but it might help too if you compress it a little bit. Slide it on over. Just like that. Now we'll take these 2 bolts that are sticking up through the top of our airbag assembly and we'll slide them up into the complementing holes in our bracket. And we'll take our flange nut and thread them into place. Now we can take a 9/16 wrench and snug these down. Now we understand torquing these 2 rear nuts is going to be difficult, but usually you can get a crow's foot in there with a torque wrench in order to torque them down properly. Now we'll take one of the shorter hex bolts that comes in our kit and install it in this threaded hole right here. And we'll take 2 more of those shorter carriage bolts. We'll slide them up through and top them with a flange nut. Us using that alignment trick earlier is making these a lot easier to install. Now we need to install the lower bracket, which will go underneath the axle. You'll notice that there's a square part of the bracket and a round part. Well, you'll also notice on the axle is square here, but round here. So we'll just match those 2 up. Get our bolts started. Slide on a flat washer, and then a nylon lock nut. Now when tightening this hardware, you want to be sure to alternate back and forth between them to ensure even pressure on this plate. Now we'll take the factory hardware that we removed from this line on the back side and we'll insert it in the new tab on the airbag. Now you just want it, when installing this, you want to make sure you've got enough room in the line itself, so make your adjustments accordingly. Then we'll take a flat washer and then one of the small nylon lock nuts. Now after you've completed the driver's side, you want to move over to the passenger side and do the same thing. Now they're going to be identical, except for the fact that the passenger side is going to have a sensor sitting on top of the frame rail, and it's going to have 2 bolts that you're going to have to remove. And then when you reinstall the sensor, you're only going to use one of the 2 holes and attach it to this top hole here. You'll have to use one of those smaller nylon lock nuts on the back side. Now with everything torqued down on our airbags, we can take our air line and get it prepped and ready to install. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to want to find the halfway point in this line. And the easiest way to do that is to stretch it all the way out, grab both ends, and then split the difference. Now once you've found your halfway point, you really want to use a set of airline cutters, which are what these are. Essentially it's just a razor blade on a flat surface. So you can do the same with a razor blade knife and then maybe like the top of a bench. But you want to just make a straight cut up and down, like that. Now the reason for this straight cut is to ensure a good seal on our push to connect fitting on the top of our airbag. So we'll slide it down on top, push down firmly, and you can see that little pop, and then pull back up in order to test it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to run our line, and then we'll come back after we're done and show you how we did it. So from the driver's side, we started here with our connection, ran it up and over the frame. They put these nice notches in the top of these. It's nice to keep the airline safe. We ran it over top of the frame, but underneath this hatch handle. And then what I did is I took a zip tie and tied it around. You just want to make sure you go around the airline too in order to keep it safe and secure. And then we went up and basically followed factory wiring all the way to the back near our hitch. From the passenger side, we did essentially the same thing as we did on the driver's side, following the factory wiring underneath this hatch channel but over top of the frame, and then we zip tied it along the way to the back near the rear bumper. To get our valves in place, there's a couple of different ways that you can mount these. We made a bracket out of a long bracket which we'll attach here. And essentially all we did was cut about 1 inch off the bottom and drilled 2 holes to be able to fit these Schrader valves in the ends of it. This always works out really nice because you're going to have to push the fitting onto the end to be able to air up your bags, and this is very, very stout in order to support that. A lot of people will also use they'll replace the bolts on their license plates with these. It's really up to you. I prefer to put it under the bumper because I think it's safer. So we'll start with putting a nut on, and you just want to thread it all the way on. Then there's star washer. Then slide it through the hole. Then put on your rubber piece, or the rubber washer. This kind of helps hold everything in place too. Then a flat washer, and then finally the last nut. And then just snug it down. Basically you want enough of the Schrader valve sticking out so that you can get the whole airline or the air chuck over top of it. If it's too short, it won't be able to trip the inside to let air in. So this is normally the point in which we would test the airbags. We usually put about 20 pounds in them and then check all of our fittings to make sure they're not leaking and that they're holding air. But because the Air Lift airbags cannot, the axle cannot hang freely from them, we're going to have to put our wheels and tires back on, and we recommend you do that too. Put our wheels and tires back on and then lower it back down to the ground, then put about 20 to 30 psi in it and test for air bubbles. Now we can take a bottle of soapy water and spray our fittings and look for any large air bubbles to form. Now that we see no rapid bubbles forming, we know that this line is good. If you do see that, you're going to want to unseat the line, make a clean cut, and reinsert it and test it again. Now, after checking all of our fittings, we have no leaks on our system. Be sure to check each one of the valves that you connected the air line to. Check those with the soapy water. That's going to do it for a look at and the installation of the Air Lift LoadLifter 5000 airbags on our 2022 Toyota Tundra.